Vietnam had originally been a colony of France pre-World War II, but after being defeated by Germany it had been handed over to the Japanese until their surrender, which returned it to French control. With the French forces too weak to occupy Vietnam at the time, British troops were sent to occupy South Vietnam, while nationalist Chinese troops occupied northern Vietnam. Eventually the French forces arrived to relieve the British and Chinese forces. Shortly afterwards, a communist group known as the League for the Independence of Vietnam began a guerrilla war against the French, resulting in the French negotiating the temporary split between the Communist North Vietnam and the Democratic South Vietnam until elections could be held to decide which government would be in charge of Vietnam. With the elections in North and South Vietnam both obviously being rigged due to both parties winning over 90% of the vote pretty much everywhere, the country was not united and war erupted shortly afterwards. As the war went on, the United States, fearing the domino theory, which is the theory that if one nation failed communism, the surrounding nations would fall as well, began to increase their military involvement in the war, starting with military advisors for the anti-communist and South Vietnamese troops. Eventually, American troops were sent in for combat after the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution was passed by Congress, which was signed after two United States destroyers were supposedly attacked by North Vietnamese submarines. The resolution allowed the President to conduct military operations in Southeast Asia without declaring war. This was the beginning of the war for the United States. The Tet Offensive began on January 30th, 1968, and was one of the biggest military campaigns in the war by North Vietnam and greatly contributed to the loss of the war by the U.S. and South Vietnam. The operations are referred to as the Tet Offensive because there was a prior agreement to a ceasefire during the Tet Lunar New Year celebrations. Both North and South Vietnam announced on national radio broadcast that there would be a 2-day ceasefire during the holiday. But the North Vietnamese broke the ceasefire and launched a campaign that would come to be known as the Tet Offensive. The decision to launch the offensive signaled the end of a long debate within the political party governing Vietnam between the moderates, who believed the economy should come first before the war and were more closely allied with the Soviets, who wanted Vietnam to reunify through political means instead of military, while the militants, on the other hand, wanted to reunify Vietnam through military means and were more closely allied with the People's Republic of China. The militants eventually won the decade-long debate after arresting many of the moderates, destroying their opposition in the government. With the moderates mostly gone, the militants could finally launch a large-scale attack to try and end the war before their resources completely ran out. They decided that since the South Vietnamese military wasn't very effective, and with the low approval rating of the president, along with strong anti-war protests in the South, if they managed to launch a successful large-scale offensive, the Southerners would rise up against the South Vietnamese government and join them in the war, silencing the calls for negotiation, military criticism, and also winning a decisive victory in the war, bringing Vietnam closer to reunification. But the offensive was designed in a way that if it failed, the Viet Cong would take the bulk of the losses and the militants would take the blame, allowing the remaining centralists and moderates to go to the negotiating table with the South and United States. The operation would begin with diversionary attacks being launched in the border areas to draw attention and forces away from the cities. Once this was underway, the main attack would commence with simultaneous attacks on several major Allied bases and most urban areas in the south, particularly Saigon, the capital, and Hue, a large city near the border. During this, U.S. forces were only secondary targets to the main goal being to begin a popular revolt and to weaken the South Vietnamese government. The northern forces began building up troops and supplies needed for this campaign, totaling 81,000 tons of supplies and 200,000 troops. They also armed the Viet Cong with new AK-47s and new rocket launchers, making them better armed than even the southern Vietnamese army. Leading up to the offensive, U.S. intelligence noticed suspicious activities but thought that the Northerners didn't have capabilities to launch a large-scale offensive. As a result, the awareness and preparations of Southern and U.S. troops slowed to them expecting a ceasefire soon. The first series of attacks occurred shortly after midnight on January 30th in 5 provincial capitals along with many other major military locations, all coming under attack simultaneously. At 0300, the main offensive began, with attacks beginning in all major population and military districts. Most of the attacks were pushed back in 1 to 3 days, but a few dragged on for days or weeks, such as the Battle of Hue. The Battle of Hue started around 0340 on January 31st, in which the local South Vietnamese troops came under attack by a large northern force and retreated to the citadel, which was a massive defensive complex that was built in the 19th century. Due to this being understaffed, the forces eventually fell and the city had to be retaken by American forces, who retook it using close quarters, house-to-house clearing tactics due to the cultural significance of the city being the old capital of the Imperial Vietnamese Kingdom. The battle eventually turned into a tug-of-war that lasted for 25 days until the Allied forces eventually retook the city. Shortly after the city was retaken, mass graves were discovered of citizens who North Vietnamese had decided were anti-communist and had killed and buried. In the aftermath of the offense, the North Vietnamese had lost half their forces and the Viet Cong had been completely decimated, but they had made significant gains in the countryside, which were retaken shortly by the Allied counterattack. South Vietnam took heavy collateral damage in the attacks, as well with heavy civilian casualties. This caused trust in the government to plummet. Due to the heavy losses sustained during the offensive, the North was about to finally come to the negotiating table, until they saw the American press and realized they didn't have to win a conventional war, they just had to keep it going until the military was forced to pull out by the civilians back home. With the Tet Offensive having been broadcasted on TV to the States, it utterly shocked the nation, since the government had been telling people that they were winning and there was no way the communists could launch a large-scale attack like this. Combined with the high casualties, support for the war plummeted and even more anti-war protests began. While the offense was a major military defeat for the North, it was a massive morale and public relations loss for the United States citizens' support of the war, which eventually led to our pulling out of the war. It was one of the major nails in the coffins that caused our withdrawal.